By imposing sweeping tariffs on foreign imports, President Donald Trump has turned U.S. trade policy on its head. The question now before the Supreme Court is whether the president has the legal authority to increase tariffs without explicit congressional approval. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Last month, President Trump said he might attend yesterday's Supreme Court arguments in the case. He did not, but his statement underscores his investment here. Should he lose, the U.S. will have to return billions of dollars already collected, a logistical nightmare. Joining me to discuss yesterday's oral arguments in the case is USA Today Supreme Court correspondent Maureen Groppe. Maureen, it's good to have you on The Excerpt.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Before we get into yesterday's arguments, tell me about this case and what the justices will be weighing here.
So this is a case about whether the president had authority under a specific law that deals with emergency situations to impose these tariffs. There are other laws that clearly give the president the ability to impose tariffs in certain circumstances, but President Trump was claiming an authority that really almost has no limits and wouldn't require him to go through the same kinds of procedures, lengthy processes, and to impose tariffs in the more limited circumstances that those other laws would allow. So the question before the court was, did the president correctly interpret this law? Was he correct that this law does give him that authority?
So President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify these sweeping tariffs broadly. What is that act designed to do?
It's never been used by a president before Trump to impose tariffs. What it's been used for is to do things like freeze assets that foreign countries have in the United States or impose embargoes. So, for example, President Carter, he was the first president to use the statute, which was passed in the 70s. And Carter used it during the Iranian hostage crisis. He froze Iranian assets in the United States as a way to try to free the hostages, free the Americans that were being held in Iran.
And what have lower courts ruled so far?
So 3 lower courts have ruled on this issue. And all 3 courts said that the president did not have the authority under this law to impose the kinds of tariffs that he has put in place. The appeals court that heard this case, though, they were not unanimous on that decision. They split 7-4 over whether the president has this authority. And even the appeals court judges who ruled that the president couldn't impose these tariffs, they were divided. Some of them thought he couldn't impose any tariffs under the law, and some of them thought, well, he could impose some, just not tariffs as sweeping as what he did put in place. So there was a bit of disagreement about exactly what this law might allow.
Maureen, what did lawyers representing the Trump administration argue in court, and how did the justices respond?
The Justice Department argued that the law clearly gives the president powers in emergency situations, that emergencies are the kind of situation where you need broad powers to a president, especially in an area like tariffs that have a foreign policy element. The law does not use the word tariffs anywhere in it. It only says that presidents have the power to regulate imports in an emergency if the president declares an emergency. And the Justice Department said that word regulate in this circumstance, that includes the power to impose tariffs. He got a lot of tough questions, not just from the 3 liberal justices on the court, but also from many of the conservative justices who were concerned about this issue of, did Congress really mean to give that large of an authority to the president? Tariffs are typically a power that the Constitution gives Congress. And so if Congress intended to delegate that much authority to the president, the court has said in the past that the statute needs to be really clear that that's what happened. And then there's also a question of, even if Congress thought that's what they were doing, are they even allowed under the Constitution to give that much authority to the president for power that the Constitution has reserved for Congress? So that's where some of the questions went during the very lengthy oral arguments, nearly 3 hours.
And who's challenging the president on these tariffs? What did they argue yesterday?
The challenge to the tariffs have been led by small businesses. There are also a dozen states that have Democratic attorney generals who have challenged the tariffs. And so we heard from a lawyer representing the businesses, and we heard from the Solicitor General of Oregon representing the states that have challenged the tariffs. And their main argument was that the administration is stretching the word regulate beyond what was intended, that and the statute doesn't mention the word tariffs. If you said that regulate includes tariffs, then a whole bunch of other statutes that use the word regulate would give the president power to tax any number of things, for example. So they said this is clearly sweeping powers that the president has grabbed for himself that belong to Congress. And there are other statutes where more limited powers have been given to the president on tariffs, and that's what the president should be allowed to do, not impose these kinds of tariffs whenever he thinks they are needed at whatever levels and for however long they're needed.
And what can you share with us about other interested groups here?
So, in addition to the written briefs that both sides file before we get the oral arguments, outside groups, they can weigh in and file what are called friend of the court briefs. They write these briefs on either side, supporting or opposing the different legal arguments that are being made. And what's unusual in a case of this magnitude is that those briefs were really lopsided. We saw very few on behalf of the administration's position, and we saw a lot on behalf of the small businesses that are suing. And interestingly, we also, a lot of those briefs that were supporting the small businesses, those came from conservatives, officials Republican officials from past administrations, conservative leaning economists, um, former judges that were appointed by Republican presidents. And that highlights the split that we've seen in the Republican Party since Donald Trump became a leader of the party. Before Trump, the Republican Party was much more, it was a free trade, free markets was a major part of the Republican Party platform. But Trump has a much more protectionist stance. And that has split a lot of the Republican Party. There are Republicans who don't agree with that, but the core of Trump's base very much likes his protectionist stance.
Maureen, are there any previous decisions handed down by the court that could give us a sense of which way this might go?
Well, one of the issues that came up during the oral arguments was something called the major questions doctrine. And this is a sort of legal tenet that the Supreme Court in recent years has identified when ruling on some major initiatives of Democratic presidents. Of President Biden is a main example of this. And in those cases, the court said when a president is is claiming a large amount of powers, especially in an emergency situation, that Congress needs to have spoken clearly. The statute needs to be very clear that he has the power to do that. And so we heard some discussion of that, some comparisons to, for example, the student loan forgiveness plan that President Biden wanted to put in place when he was president. And the court struck that down. The court said President Biden tried to do that on an emergency basis under an emergency law. And the court said, no, that emergency law did not stretch to include the kind of program that President Biden wanted to enact. And so there was a debate about, was this the same kind of thing or is this different? Because even though tariffs are essentially a tax on the American businesses that are importing the products and Americans who are buying the products, that it also has a foreign policy element. And this so-called major questions doctrine has not been applied to the president's foreign powers before. It's only been applied in the domestic sense. So it's unclear how much that will factor into the justice's decision. But if the Supreme Court does uphold these tariffs, you're going to hear a lot of complaints from Democrats that the court is holding President Trump to a different standard than they held President Biden for some of his major policies.
The president asked for this case to be heard quickly, which the court obliged. Has this court been favorable to President Trump during his second administration?
Generally, yes, although this is the first time that the court is taking on what is called the underlying issue of the case. The court so far has been issuing these temporary rulings that say, okay, what's the state of play while the president's policies are being challenged? Should the president be allowed to, for example, kick transgender troops out of the military while that new policy is being challenged? Should he be allowed to dismantle the Foreign Aid Services Department? Should he be allowed to lay off federal workers, cut federal spending, those kinds of things? And The Supreme Court, by and large, in those cases have said, yes, the president's policies should continue while challenges to them are working their way through the system. But in this case, this is now the challenges have worked their way through the system, through the lower courts, and now the Supreme Court has to decide once and for all, should these tariffs were these tariffs imposed legally? Should the president retain the power to impose tariffs like this?
Maureen, is there any sign which way the court is leaning?
Well, that's always a very difficult thing to predict from oral arguments, and even when the justices themselves meet after an argument and they go around the table and they each say which way, how they vote. When it comes to writing up the opinions to go along with that decision, once they see the arguments in writing, they can change their mind. So it's tricky to predict how it's going, how they're going to rule, and the experts that I spoke to after the oral arguments, they put their thumb on the scale a little bit towards the president losing, but they weren't completely confident in that, and they said it's a close call. And one expert also said even if the president loses, it was hard to see a majority coalescing around one particular reason for that. So we could get a decision where the president wins or loses, but the justices have different justifications for that. So a majority might come down on one side, but they might take a different path to get there. It could be tricky to figure out what's going on exactly when we get that decision.
What are the stakes here for the Trump presidency should he lose this appeal? And what might it mean going forward for future presidents should he win?
This has major implications for Trump's agenda because the tariffs are a centerpiece of both his economic agenda and his foreign policy agenda. That said, though, as I mentioned before, there are other statutes that the president can use to impose many of these same tariffs. Now, he has to go through a different process to do that. That'll take longer. They're more limited. He could end up getting challenges to those as well. But he isn't left without any other means of imposing tariffs if the court says he can't impose tariffs this way. But if the court says he can, that would be major, not just for President Trump's agenda, but it would also signal a lot of deference to presidents in emergency situations. And there's various other emergency laws test how far presidents can push things, and if President Trump can push tariffs in this emergency situation, what can he do in other emergency situations? It would potentially open the door for that. And that's one thing that the lawyer for the businesses tried to argue, essentially planting the bug that, hey, this is he didn't use these terms, but essentially, okay, this is a conservative court. They may look more favorably on conservative policies that presidents try to put in place during emergencies. But what if we get a Democratic president who wants to use tariffs because he claims that there's a climate emergency, for example? If you allow one kind of emergency, you're going to have to allow the other kind of emergency. So that was a way for the lawyers representing the businesses to say, you need to look at the broader implications for allowing President Trump, if you are going to allow President Trump to impose tariffs under an emergency statute.
And then should the court decide against the Trump administration, what could it mean for the U.S. economy?
Well, the tariffs have had a destabilizing effect on the economy. So getting rid of these tariffs could help with the certainty that businesses say that they need. And even if the president does try to use other statutes, because those statutes do have a more bureaucratic process for imposing tariffs, it would give businesses more notice, more of a chance to comment on those tariffs, so they would gain some more stability. It'd be a more stable situation, even if they did end up with tariffs in some cases. But if there is a potential negative effect on the economy if the tariffs go away, the administration is relying on them to raise significant amount of revenue for the federal budget. They were used to offset some of the costs that are associated with the president's tax cuts and some policies that Congress enacted in his major policy bill earlier this year. So if the revenue from the tariffs goes away, that will have implications for the federal budget.
There have been a lot of challenges to the president's agenda, but can you give us the historical significance of this case?
Well, this is the first major test of the president's expansive view of presidential powers to be fully litigated at the Supreme Court. It's not the only case like that they're going to hear this term. They're going to take up a case also about the president's ability to control agencies that were set up to have some degree of independence from politics from presidents. And we are likely to also have them weigh in on the president's the changes he wants to make to birthright citizenship and some of the other things that he's doing on immigration. This is the start of the Supreme Court saying whether or not there are limits to how far they're going to let the president push the limits on how much authority the president has to act on his own without Congress and without checks from the courts.
Okay, what's next? When is the court expected to hand down its decision?
Well, in general, the Supreme Court can take until the end of its term to hand down cases, and their term usually ends end of June, beginning of July. And a lot of the major cases do take all the way until June because those are the toughest cases. And you get a lot of back and forth potentially from justices. Once the majority writes their opinion, and then they see the dissent from the minority, and then they respond to that. So that can go back and forth for a while. But the court took this case on an expedited basis, and there's some expectation that they're going to try to rule sooner rather than later because of the need for certainty in what's going to happen with these tariffs. And also, the longer that they go on, the more revenue the government potentially has to reimburse if the Supreme Court decides, nope, they shouldn't have been imposed in the first place.
All right, Maureen Groppe covers the Supreme Court for USA Today. It is always good to have you on, Maureen.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.